Today's keynote speaker, I'm very fortunate to be able to give him the intro here. Today's keynote speaker obviously requires very little introduction, but deserves a great introduction. We're honored to have with us Dries Buytaert. Dries actually spoke here back the second anniversary of Design for Drupal, so our second year Dries was here speaking, and fortunately, graciously he came back to present at our 10th anniversary. Dries wears many hats, as a lot of you know. Developer, open source advocate, Acquia, founder and project lead at Acquia, and he's also the president and founder of the Drupal Association. He holds a PhD in computer science and engineering from Ghent University, and is a young global leader in the World Economic Forum. And certainly, last but not least, we all know Dries as the founder of something great, and we all know it's called Drupal, and that's why we're here today. So I want to tell you just how about this keynote came about. So after DrupalCon Baltimore, Saturday after the DrupalCon, I was out just walking around, and I was standing at a crosswalk. Dries was standing next to me at the crosswalk. We're waiting for the light to change. Me being very shy, I would never have spoken to Dries, but for some reason I got up the courage just to say, thank you for everything you've done for the Drupal community, because without Drupal I wouldn't have this job, I wouldn't have this great community of people I consider friends now, and I get to go around the country and different DrupalCons and camps and meet all the people that I see from year to year. So without Dries, that wouldn't have been possible. And the Drupal community is awesome, and we have to thank Dries for that. Today, Dries is going to speak to us about the future of JavaScript in Drupal, which is very exciting. We can't thank Dries enough, obviously, for coming and joining us for this 10th anniversary of Design for Drupal. So without further ado, please join me in giving a big round of applause to Dries Buytaert.
Thank you, Leslie. That was very kind. Is my mic working well? Yes. Yeah? Yes. Excellent. So I'm going to talk a little about front-end stuff. And so first thing you need to know is that I'm not a front-end developer. I'm horrible with design and all of that kind of stuff, but I'm still going to try and talk about it, right? It's a little bit different than my normal presentation. All right, so Leslie already introduced me. I'll repeat it very briefly and very quickly, but I started the Drupal project 18 years ago, it's a long time ago, out of my dorm in Antwerp, Belgium, where I was living at the time. And I did that for 7+ years as a hobby project, at night, on the weekends. It's when we started DrupalCons and the Drupal Association, and about 7 years into the project, I really felt that for Drupal to get to the next level and to help some of the larger users of Drupal be successful, that Drupal would really benefit from having a company that would be to Drupal what Red Hat was to Linux. For me, Red Hat was really important. I remember messing around with Slackware and all of that kind of stuff, and then eventually Red Hat came out and they made Linux a lot easier to consume, and so I felt that was important, and so started a company called Acquia and decided to start it in Boston, while I was living in Belgium. And so I've been doing Acquia for almost 11 years as well. So that's a little bit of background on me. As I said, I'm not a front-end developer, so bear with me. But what I want to talk about today is these 4 topics. I want to talk a little bit about the history of JavaScript, a little bit about the history of Drupal, and how they sort of where they overlap or where that overlap matters. And then I want to give you an update on the API First initiative. It's a Drupal 8 initiative, as well as the JavaScript modernization initiative, right? Because these two kind of come together. Let's get started. And then in the end, there will be plenty of time for questions, and you can ask me any kind of question. It doesn't have to be about the presentation. In fact, I once went to a presentation and somebody asked me, what hair gel do you use? And I actually didn't know the answer, even though I use it every day. It's I know it's yellow and has a great cap, but I couldn't remember the brands for some reason, and I still can't. Anyhow, so don't ask that question. Let's talk a little bit about JavaScript. So how many of you know that JavaScript was invented in just 10 days? Raise your hand if you do. All right, very few people do, but it's true. In May 1995, JavaScript was invented by Brendan Eich. He was working at Netscape at the time. He just spent 10 days to create the first version of JavaScript. And in the beginning, people obviously didn't take JavaScript very serious. And in fact, for a lot of professional developers, a lot of professional programmers, JavaScript was, kind of poo-pooed. It was for amateurs, it wasn't real. And I remember that because in the early days of Drupal, we would actually work really hard not to have any JavaScript in Drupal because it was not cool and it was not professional. And so that was in the early days of Drupal. But slowly, but certainly, JavaScript started to get a lot more traction and more developers started to use JavaScript. I would say that one of the big tipping points was in 2004 with the launch of Gmail. I don't know how many of you remember that, but obviously Google launched Gmail, and it was actually remarkable at the time because it was interactive, responsive, very quick. And this in contrast with a lot of the competitors which I have on the other slide here, like Yahoo Mail and Hotmail. They just looked very old instantly the moment Gmail was released. And it wasn't just the interaction of the application, if you will, but it was also the fact that I believe Google had decided to give everybody like 2 gigabytes of free storage or something, and Hotmail you got like 50 megabytes or something like a lot smaller. And so that really caught the attention of a lot of people. And people said, wow, you can actually build pretty interesting applications with JavaScript. So that was a big tipping point. I would say the way that was built was using the XML HTTP request concept, and really allowed them to sort of load data asynchronously in the background, if you will, and to create a much more interactive kind of experience for an email client. And as I said, caught the attention of a lot of developers around the world. I remember this, vividly myself, actually, where we would have conversations on IRC and the likes, and you're like, wow, that's actually really, really different from anything else that we've seen. And then Google did it again. In 2005, they launched Google Maps, and it was, again, different from other mapping applications. Like you could scroll and you could click and zoom and all of these things which you couldn't really do as smoothly or interactively as with some of these other applications. Google Maps was, by the way, also the first large company to offer a JavaScript API for its application. And so people could actually write JavaScript applications sort of on top of Google Maps. And so, again, they used XML HTTP request approach, and slowly that started to become, what is now known as AJAX. Became sort of a term for this kind of approach, which then in turn led to what I would call like sort of a renaissance period for JavaScript. And you got frameworks like Prototype and jQuery and Dojo and MooTools. And it's also around this time that Drupal adopted jQuery. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you may not know that we decided to adopt jQuery in core as the first sort of CMS in the world. And at the time, jQuery was very small and very few people would use it, and it was actually a fairly controversial decision of us to go with jQuery because people would say, you've got to use Prototype or you've got to use this, which are more established. And so I would say that Drupal really meaningfully helped put jQuery on the map. And it led to many other projects adopting jQuery. And so that was pretty cool, I think. In 2008, Google launched Chrome with a faster JavaScript engine. It's called V8. And it was actually ahead of its time in a way. And so I have a quote in here from the original press release, and they wrote, we also built a more powerful JavaScript engine to power the next generation of web applications that aren't even possible in today's browser. And that's 10 years ago, right? And if you read that today, it's like, wow, that's a pretty forward-looking, accurate press release. Because I would argue that V8 really helped do that, right? And so that was a big milestone, I would say, in the history of JavaScript. To me, it was really interesting too because V8 sort of improved performance of JavaScript applications by 10x compared to Internet Explorer. And as Leslie mentioned, I did a PhD in computer science, but it had nothing to do with Drupal. Had everything to do with runtime compilers and memory management. So I helped work on making the Java virtual machine faster. And so I spent about 6 or 7 years of my life working on this kind of stuff. And so I remember writing my PhD thesis when V8 launched. I'm like, wow, I was very interested in it and went and spent a bunch of time reading up on what they did and how they did it. But that was a pretty big milestone, I would say. 2010, Twitter made sort of a special move that was, I would say, unprecedented in JavaScript's history. So they updated twitter.com to be sort of like a client-server application where they had an API server, basically, that offered a single endpoint that all of the different front ends would use, both their website, their mobile application, but also other clients that people developed. In doing so, they had to move a lot of the rendering that would historically been done on the server side to the client side, right? And so all of a sudden, Twitter.com started doing a lot of client-side JavaScript rendering. And so in this model, and I mean, you may all know this, a JavaScript client in the browser, running in the visitor's browser, fetches data from that API server and then renders the user experience, right? It's a model that's today much more commonly known, but at the time was pretty unique, especially at Twitter scale. And so unfortunately it didn't work very well. And Twitter struggled for many, many years, not just because of this, but also because their growth, but between their architectural choices and their sort of explosive growth in terms of user adoption, they really struggled with pretty severe performance problems, let's say. And one of the biggest challenges was that the time to first interaction was pretty poor, right? And so the way this was built, the client, the browser, had to download a whole lot of data and a whole lot of JavaScript, and only when it was all downloaded, all of it could get parsed, and only then could it get executed. And so by the time something was actually shown on the page in the browser, would be pretty slow, right? And so they suffered through this thing for multiple years, I think about 2, maybe 3 years. And then finally in 2012, Twitter sort of reversed the course, and they said, this super unique model that we helped pioneer, we're going to roll it back, or partially roll it back. And so they moved a lot of the rendering back to the server, where it was originally. And so this was good, right? I think I have it on the next slide. That was good because now the server would render a lot of things and could cache that, so it didn't have to redo that every single time, and then would basically render the initial page, send it to the browser. The browser could instantly show it much faster, and then they would use JavaScript to add the interactive experience on top of that initial page render. And so, great, because the browser doesn't have to run JavaScript to actually show something and can show it instantly. And then after the initial content is rendered, we can add these additional things. That was a huge win because it actually improved performance, or time to first, I guess it's a turn byte or something, was improved by 80%. So a big improvement for Twitter's performance. Then in 2013, Airbnb, I don't know how many of you know that, but they basically took that model from Twitter and they made it even better, right? So in this case, they used Node.js to do isomorphic JavaScript, meaning the sort of the same rendering engine on the client and the server, so that they can have universal or shared JavaScript between the server side and the client side. Oh wow, I didn't know it was animated. I saw something happening there. And so that was a big advantage, that model, because it made the code a lot more reusable, basically. All right, and so that obviously was a big milestone in the history as well. And that's now several years ago. Fast forward another, so many years, and I would say the JavaScript world has, advanced quite a bit. There's these tools like Babel, which we use in Drupal, or Nightwatch for testing. I mean, the ecosystem of tooling around it has really kind of evolved. And so JavaScript went from being a little prototype thing that was written in just 10 days to now, being used across the stack, across the technology stack, server-side, client-side, and used by websites, small and large, all around the world, right? So that's a little bit the history of JavaScript. So now, let me transfer and tell you a little bit about the history of Drupal. I imagine quite a few of you know the history of Drupal, so I don't want to repeat that. But as I mentioned, I figured like by now everybody has seen this photo, but maybe not. But this is me 18 years ago in my dorm. It was 4 by 4 meters. I don't know how much that is in feet, but pretty small. And that was my world. I had my bed, my desk, my sink, my microwave, all of these things in one little room. And it's where I decided to start Drupal. When I did start Drupal, my original plan was just to spend a couple days writing a message board so I could stay in touch with my friends. And I wanted to use PHP and MySQL because at the time they were like new, and I wanted to learn them. And I'd been building websites before, but I would use Perl and Tickle CK, and we would write to flat files for storing data. And so having a database was like, wow, you can actually store things in a database. That was pretty cool. And being able to use PHP was also kind of a big deal, especially for me because I had a background at the time of writing C code. And PHP and C were, fairly similar, I would say. And so I started Drupal, wanted to build a message board, and I was planning to spend 2 nights on it. And here we are, 18 years later. How many of you know this story? Is it useful to talk about that a little bit more? Oh, wow, very few people do. I can tell you a little bit more. Is that useful? Yeah? All right. And so that little message board was a lot of fun. And we would leave each other messages like, hey, let's have dinner at 7, or during the exams, we would post like goofy photos and, just to kind of like make life a little bit more fun in between all the studying. And so then I graduated. I finished college. And so it was kind of sad to shut it down because it was running on a server in my room, right? It was like an intranet style thing. It wasn't on the public internet. And so I decided that we would keep this little community going. And so I wanted to move it to the public internet and so to register a domain name. And so I came up with a name which was Dorp, D-O-R-P, which is Dutch, which is my native language. And it means small village or small community, which I felt was appropriate because, it was just like a handful or maybe 10 people or so that were using this message board. And as I registered the domain name, I made a typo. And I ended up switching the O and the R. And so I ended up registering drop.org, drop.org. And I'm like, holy smokes, it's still available. Like I'm a millionaire or something. Because it's like a 4-letter word. And it's an English word, it means something. I'm like, oh, it's pretty cool. And so I went with that instead. I quickly changed my mind and moved the site there. And very quickly, that evolved into what I would call sort of an experimental platform. I started adding a lot other capabilities. RSS was being sort of invented at the time. And I mean, it had nothing to do with that, but I was on the mailing list where they would invent RSS, and I'm like, oh, I can implement this. And so I would add that to my little message board. People started keeping what they called public diaries, which became blogging, right? And so added a public diary feature to Drupal. That's what it was called. If you go to the original release announcement, you can still find that. And a bunch of other things. More and more people came to my website. Especially people interested in the future of the web, I would say, because I would also talk about it. And so at some point, drop.org also accepted articles from other people. And then we would have a voting mechanism. Others could vote on them, and then the best articles would go to the main page, which is basically what Dig ended up doing, or even Reddit today, right? And so, drop.org 17, 18 years ago had that kind of functionality. Now, as I said in the beginning of the talk, I was a horrible designer, so it didn't look anything like it, and it wasn't as compelling to use as some of these, more modern platforms. But either way, it attracted a number of people interested in the future of the web, and they started giving me suggestions and recommendations, on, maybe how to tweak the algorithm for the, promoting articles. And I said, you know what, instead of me doing all the work, how about I just give you access to the source code, right? And so I literally copied the Linux kernel GPL license file, because I was using Linux and contributing a little bit to the Linux project at that time. So I copied the GPL.txt file into my website, created a tarball zip file, if you will, and uploaded it to drop.org, and maybe expected, and I had to come up with a name. So I spent 30 seconds thinking of a name. It's like Drupal. And it wasn't like a planning process, but, so drop, in English, obviously, is drop, but in Dutch, the word drop is Drupal. And I figured, Drupal, let's maybe have an American would pronounce the word Drupal, and I felt that was good enough, and so uploaded it. I expected a few people to download it and use it, and yeah, some people did. And so it wasn't until later that we had the domain name, Drupal.org. And I think actually Mo, she's here. Mo, you were on drop.org.
I was on drop, definitely.
See? Way to go. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else was. Probably not. No? There you go. So that's a little bit, there's a very long history. If you want more, ask me questions about it at the end of the presentation. But anyway, when I started Drupal, HTML4 was just released and people thought CSS was all the rage. I remember us moving styling to CSS because that was where the future was at. As I said, JavaScript was for amateurs, not something we wanted to use. I don't think Moshe wanted to use it either. I don't want to put you on the spot about it. I may have forgotten to, but anyhow. Google was only in its infancy. People forget, but like the whole SEO thing wasn't really that big of a thing back then. Mobile definitely didn't exist. I remember AT&T, which I didn't have access to in Belgium, but they had just launched text messaging, like the original text messaging, right? And so, let alone mobile, obviously social didn't exist either. Blogging wasn't invented, as I mentioned. And so, I think what's special is that Drupal has managed to reinvent itself. And it's probably one of the few platforms on the web that's 18 years old and still relevant, right? And so I think we've done an incredible job as a project to challenge the status quo and to embrace evolution of technologies and trends. And yeah, I still think that's the case. And so today, for those that are relatively new to Drupal, we're one of the largest open source projects in the world. We have thousands of people contributing, obviously hundreds of thousands of people using it. Our website, Drupal.org, for some reason gets 13 million unique visits a year, which to me is sort of a miracle because it's a pretty boring website. It's not like it's a news website where you can find interesting events that happen in the world, or where things leak that are newsworthy. No, it's pretty much our community website, which is incredible. But for it to get 13 million page views, unique visitors even, it's pretty remarkable. And so I take a lot of pride in that notion that we have reinvented ourselves so many times, and in the process of reinventing ourselves, we've actually thrived. We've grown every single time. And so what I wanted to talk a little bit more about is how we are reinventing ourselves again, or the things we're doing to be set up for the future. So obviously we released Drupal 8 a couple of years ago. Was maybe off to a slow start, but it's been accelerating. This is a slide that I used in my keynote at DrupalCon, but just the last year we saw a 51 increase in Drupal 8 adoption. We saw an even bigger increase in adoption of contributed modules, the readiness, stable releases, I should say, of contributed modules. I think last week we broke 4,000 stable modules for Drupal 8, which is pretty cool. And I would say, a lot of great things went into Drupal 8, a lot of great things. But if I look back at, 7 years of Drupal 8 or something, this feels like a long time. I would say there's sort of two big themes. One is a focus on ease of use, specifically for content creators and site builders, between in-place editing and adding WYSIWYG and redesigning the node creation page or content creation page and a whole bunch of other things. I think we've made, pretty good steps towards making Drupal easier to use for less technical people. Now, we have a lot more work to do. It's not good enough. But we continue to work on that with the new release model, right? We're working on things like the media initiative, where we're adding media library to core, which was actually committed for inclusion in 8.6. We're working on the layout builder, which is super exciting. A lot of people are very excited about the layout builder. And so there's a whole track of different initiatives that are focused on making Drupal easier to use for content creators. But then the second point is I would say that Drupal 8 marks the start of Drupal's evolution to an API-first platform, right? And so I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think that's probably the most relevant piece for this conference. And so about 7 years ago, we basically decided that it would be a good idea to have an API-first initiative. And that we wanted to add the REST API to core. And I remember, because this was at DrupalCon Chicago, I think it was at DrupalCon Chicago, but I stood up on stage in my keynote and I said, if I were to start Drupal from scratch today, what would I do? And I said I would probably design it to be an API-first platform. And so we basically set out to not start from scratch, although we came pretty close in some areas, I would say. But we basically sort of started working towards adding REST API to core. And when we released Drupal 8, it actually shipped with a REST API. The REST API in Drupal 8 was, I would say, okay at best. It wasn't awesome. And so for the last 2 years, we have spent a lot of effort trying to make it better. And so we've had a dedicated team, actually, at Acquia, I should say, of at least 2 people working on this for a long time. And so today, I actually think we have one of the best REST APIs of all open source content management systems, and not just open source content management systems, but any content management system. I'm not saying we have the best, but it's getting richer and more mature as well. And yeah, we're going to keep working on it, make it better. And it's been pretty amazing to see progress. Every minor release of Drupal, so 8.4, 8.5, and 8.6, which we'll release later this year, like it gets better and better. Every time we drop some improvements. In 8.6, for example, we added file upload support. So all of a sudden you can upload files with the REST API, and so it gets better and better, which is pretty exciting. In parallel, we're also working on JSON API and GraphQL. The development is done as contributed modules, but these 2 modules are actually pretty robust today, and we have a roadmap for Drupal to move them into core. We're going to start with JSON API. We're actually pretty close to being ready to include it in 8.6, the next version, if we wanted to. There's a couple of blockers we need to address, but we're also talking about, like, do we actually want it in 8.6? Or is it actually a little bit better to wait for 8.7? Because while it's widely used, while it's stable, we might be able to innovate a little bit quicker as a contributed module. So we're kind of trying to decide the next few weeks what we're going to do with the JSON API module. And then GraphQL will come later. Now, both JSON API and GraphQL, I don't know how many of you know these technologies. Yeah, raise your hand maybe real quick. All right. More people know those than they know the history of Drupal. That's good. But obviously, they're interesting because I think one of the strengths of Drupal is sort of the entity graph, if you will, or the entity system. And with the REST API, you have to do multiple requests to get the data. Maybe in this case, you need to start with, get the meetup, and then once you have the meetup, you can have to do another request to get the speaker, and stuff like that. So a lot of different API calls. And what's great about JSON API and GraphQL is that you can get that data in one query, so it's faster, less latency, less round trips to the server. And you can also specify specifically what you want to retrieve. Like, if you only need one field of the entity, you can request just one field. So there's a couple of good reasons why these modules are, pretty interesting to have in core. So really, where that leaves us is that Drupal is, it's a content management system as you've always known it, but it's in addition to that also becoming, I don't know if it's, content service or a content repository that organizations and individuals are starting to use to build decoupled applications, right? And many more organizations are starting to. And so what they do is they use any of the modern JavaScript frameworks, can be React, Angular, Ember, Vue, anything, to build a application on top of Drupal. And I think that's pretty well understood in the Drupal community today, but I think we can do more to tell that story outside of the Drupal community. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but there's quite a few examples of organizations that do that. You can see some here. Some of them are pretty large. And yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think Princess Cruises is actually a fun one. You can see it at the top, but they have cruise ships. And so they have they use quite a bit of Drupal, and so and it's interesting because of a decoupled application, but also because there's a lot of other decoupled things going on under the hood. So for example, they want to create like a unified customer experience. And so that starts from the moment you book your cruise to your experience on the ship. And so what they do is when you book the cruise, you can enter all sorts of preferences, I don't know, food preferences. You can book restaurants and stuff like that. But then when you enter the ship, the boat, they have these tablets in the room, and they have these kiosk screens around their boat, and they carry over that information that you enter. So they try to personalize that experience. But anyway, they use Drupal for that as well, right? To power these kiosks, to power these tablets. And so they use decoupled Drupal on the ship too. And actually, as a side note, as an anecdote, what's really interesting is that these boats, when they, I don't know, cross the Atlantic Ocean, they often lose internet. And so they have racks of servers where they run Drupal locally. And then when they regain connectivity, they have to like sync all the data between two Drupal sites. I mean, they're doing some pretty cool things with Drupal. And, and so API first Drupal is very useful for those kinds of users, not just because they want to decouple the UI, but also because they want to integrate, Drupal sites with one another, right? Or they want to integrate with third-party services too on the backend, whether it's CRM systems or marketing automation tools, these kinds of things. And here's actually another example of that. New Balance, I think it's a local company, no? Yeah. So they have a Drupal site that's decoupled, but then they also have this native application where you can tell them what you like, what you're into, and so both the native application as well as the website, they use the REST API, and so they use like a headless Drupal or a decoupled Drupal as a content repository to serve both these endpoints. And so I thought it was a pretty cool local example of a decoupled site. All right, so that is really the API first initiative, right? So we're working on making the REST API better. We're working on adding more APIs, like file upload being an example. And we're also working on adding JSON API to core. We're very close to being able to add it to core. In the longer term, we want to add GraphQL to core as well. So, all right, last section. And then we'll have time for questions, I think. At the same time, we have another initiative, which is to work towards a JavaScript-driven Drupal admin UI, right? And so it's awesome that all these organizations and individuals can use decoupled applications to build experiences for their customers. But Drupal's own UI that is used by site builders and content creators, could benefit from these things too. Like, could be more interactive, could be, sort of more modern, I guess, in general. And so we felt that Drupal needs to provide a cutting-edge experience for its own users as well. So we've been talking about that for some time, and in DrupalCon Vienna we had a meeting with a whole bunch of people, and we decided that we wanted to try and build a alternative UI, not remove the existing UI right now, but start with building a second UI, if you will, just for Drupal's own administrative UI, and that we were going to use React to do that. And so that's what we've been doing since Vienna. We've been prototyping different things. You can find that in GitHub somewhere. I don't have the URL in here, but they basically, I think the first thing they did is they built a React application that is that replaces the permissions page. They wanted to start somewhere, and so I think it's admin / user / permission or something. that page with the long list of permissions.
People, not users.
That's right. People, admin/people, right? /permissions, you're right. And so that's where they started. And it was a great experiment because they learned a lot of things just trying to replace that one page. And so out of that experiment, we identified sort of 6 steps of things that we wanted to do. And so I wanted to walk you through them real quick. So step 1 is they want to use the JSON API. It's a widely used specification for building decoupled applications. Most people use JSON API, and so they felt like we want to build this using the JSON API versus sort of straight up REST API. And so as I said, we're pretty close. So I feel like we're in good shape there. Second thing we said is like, wow, we don't actually have good testing infrastructure for JavaScript. Like we have incredible testing infrastructure for PHP code. Like we really have some of the best that I've seen, along with the workflows that we have. But for JavaScript codes, we don't, right? And so we expect to have a lot more JavaScript in the future. And so we had to make a fairly significant investment in putting that sort of foundation in place, and we decided to use Nightwatch. And so Nightwatch is already committed for inclusion in 8.6, which is great news. But there's a couple of loose ends, if you will, that we still need to add. Sort of a next layer of abstraction above the just the Nightwatch tool. Like for example, we need some APIs so you can log in and log out of a Drupal site using JavaScript and stuff like that to help people write tests. And so obviously completing that work is essential. So we have, a good testing framework and we can avoid regressions. The third one is a big one and might be something where you can help. Obviously having React and JavaScript is just some tooling. Like what we really need is, designs and, prototypes and, all that kind of stuff. So we can figure out how can this work? How can a new UI actually work and be better? And that's probably the hard work, I would say, because we've done a couple of simple designs and the team is actually incredibly fast at turning these designs into something that's functional. So, I think the hard work is creating a design for a new UI that is user tested and proven to be much better than the old UI. And so I would say definitely an area where we want and need help. There's people working on it, Roy and Christina. Christina, she lives in Barcelona, I think, but she got some time from her employer for the next several months to work on this full time. Roy is working nights and evenings on this. So we've got people working on this, but it's a small team of people, and they could use some help. If that's a passion of yours, please get involved. The fourth item is maybe a little bit more special, but we want to provide modules a way to either use Twig, our current templating system, or React. And so we're trying to figure out how do we do that, right? And the reason we want to do that is because we're not going to do like a Big Bang style swap of the entirety of the Drupal UI into a React application. And so we want to be thoughtful of, where can we introduce a React-based experience that's more dynamic, more interactive, and how can we do that incrementally so we don't have to do like these sweeping changes. And it would also be nice to give module developers that kind of optionality, right? Like not everything benefits from React. There's a lot of simple UIs that can probably use Twig, and so we're trying to figure out how do we combine both without sort of sacrificing that experience. And so they're doing experiments around the routing system in Drupal to see how that can be done. And the fifth item is just implementing the permissions page that I mentioned, they discovered that, there's actually no API to get a list of all the permissions. And so as we built this stuff, we discover gaps in our API coverage. And that's not surprising because some of these admin UIs, we need to retrieve data that's not commonly requested by, let's say, front-end facing applications. So for now, the team has actually sort of put these APIs, they closed the API gap by creating a contributed module where they kind of, I won't call it quick and dirty, but let's call it quick and dirty way of closing the gap, right? And so what we need to do is we need to move those APIs from that contributed module to core. And we need to figure out where else do we have gaps and create APIs. It's probably an area where a lot of people could jump in and help. I'm not saying it's the easiest place to get involved, but it's also not the hardest place to get involved. There's concrete tasks there that can be done by a lot of people. And so that's an area. And then this one is a hard one. Like, how do we make a React UI extensible and configurable? Right? So one of the strengths of Drupal today is we have all these modules, you enable a module and boom, the UI changes a little bit. There's some new functionality exposed. And so that's harder to do. And I'm not a React developer, but it's harder to do in React, right? You have to, rebuild the application, that kind of stuff. So we're trying to figure out how do we balance that? Where do we allow people to extend the UI, and then what's the experience? What's the experience of enabling a new module that comes with some React? Like, how do you do that? So these are some of the things we're trying to figure out. That's why we're doing a prototype to flesh these things out and to see how we feel about it. Because it has a lot of potential if we can figure it out in a way that's that's going to benefit us. The good news is that almost all of what I just told you, these 6 steps, almost all of them are also super relevant for people that are building decoupled applications on top of Drupal for their visitors, right? Like the testing framework, JSON API, GraphQL, closing the gaps in API coverage. Everybody benefits from that, whether we decide to swap out the backend with a React backend or not. It's good work. So that's a little bit about what we're doing. So these are the 4 things I talked about. I want to thank all the people that have been involved in this and all the organizations behind them, because between the API First initiative and the JavaScript initiative and all of the design work, it's been the work of a lot of people for 7+ years. And even before we talked about adding web services in core, there were contributed modules that really helped us figure out the foundations, and we could leverage that work. And so let's give a quick round of applause for all these people. It's pretty amazing to see, and you know that, but like it's pretty amazing to see how so many people have come together around this. If you want to help, please help. I think this is probably one of the highest impact areas that you can help. If you think about it, Drupal is used by, more than 1 million websites, which means it's used by millions of people that enter content in the UI, that, do these kinds of things. And so even a small contribution to this work will benefit a lot of people. And it's different from 10 years ago. And I had that realization not too long ago. Like 10 years ago, organizations had one website, and I feel like they would add some content and then sort of step away from the website for 6 months. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying everyone was like that, but often it was like you build it, you launched it, and that's it. And today, there's so many people that live in Drupal, right? I remember I went to, New York in CBSC or something, MSNBC, is that something? Yeah. Sorry. I'm, not being born here, I don't know all these stations as well as some of the people that are local, but they're using Drupal, and they invited me to New York to come and visit their office, and I walked into, this building, and there's it was so massive, and there's hundreds of people sitting there. And the person next to me that gave the tour says, "Oh yeah, they're all entering content in Drupal." Right? And so I get goosebumps, because it's wow, you have 100+ people in this room, and all they do is entering content in Drupal all day long. They literally live in Drupal. And that's just one organization. And so any small improvement we can make goes a long way to making the lives of these people easier, right? And that's what people have come to expect nowadays. When you only updated content once every 6 months, it was okay, it was a little clunky, but if that's your job all day long, you want it to be easy to use. So, huge impact. Any kind of contribution in this area would be big. So please do get involved if you can. If you can't, that's okay too. But if you can, please try. And so, long story short, we've made a lot of great progress on these things. I guess as a final slide, I want to say, Drupal is no longer the Drupal you used to know. There's a lot of people that have looked at Drupal 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and they've maybe discarded it, and they have an opinion about what Drupal is and what it isn't. It's amazing when I travel and I speak to people. So many people don't even know what we're doing with API First, right? It's because we kind of live in our own, not bubble, but in our own world. And so another way you can help is to really help tell that story. I spoke at a Frontend United, which was born a Drupal conference, but has expanded to be a lot more than just Drupal. And there's a lot of non-Drupal people. And so many people came to me and said, "Wow, I didn't even know this," right? And so, the question is, how do we go to where those people are? People that are building decoupled applications. I would say today they probably think about, let's use MongoDB as our database. But really, what we want them to think is, if you're building a content-rich decoupled application, right? I'm not saying we will replace MongoDB, but if you use a decoupled application where there's content, and maybe you have to manage content, translate content, have some workflow around the content, they should really think about, wow, Drupal is a potential backend, right? And I can tell you that today, almost no one outside of the Drupal community that's building these kinds of applications thinks about Drupal as an option. And so we need to find ways to bring that story to them. And we need to go to where they are. And you know better than I, because I'm not a front-end developer, but whether it's trying to publish, articles or tutorials on websites what's it called, Smashing Magazine, is that one? All of the great sites that the front-end people use, how do we get on there? And so that's another way you can contribute, or going to their conferences and talking about Drupal as a content repository, as a backend that people can use to build these applications. So, Drupal is no longer the Drupal that it used to be 10 years ago, 18 years ago, even 5 years ago. And so please help spread the word if you believe me and you're convinced of that as well. So please do. So that's what I have. And I think we have some time for Q&A. Yeah. You can ask me any question. I think, do we want to use the mic for the recording? Yeah, so we're recording this, so if you don't mind using the mic, so we can record your question too.
I'm real curious about, I see a lot of parallels between the decision a while back to adopt jQuery and bring that in forth, and the decision to take React and adopt that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the decision-making process and specifically the parallels between the two. It seems like jQuery was up and coming versus React having like kind of a pretty large market share at this point.
That's a good question. So the decision-making process for bringing React into the core, it's a hard one. I started writing about it on my blog to see what the appetite was. Maybe 3 years ago, I would say. And it was very clear that there's a lot of different opinions. Like the reactions were like, use this, use that, use this. And also a lot of people saying, we don't want this at all. Or we can't fix something because the JavaScript world is in constant change. There's no like steady state here. And so, but that was true at the time we had jQuery. Now obviously we're a much bigger project, so we looked at a lot of different elements, I would say. Like we looked at the maturity of different technologies like Angular, React, Vue. That was important to us. We looked at the sentiment around it outside of Drupal, because I think it serves as a tool for existing Drupal people, but it's also an opportunity to bring new people to Drupal, right? And so we looked at that, and obviously React was the number one. We also looked at the release cycle, which is really important. How they do release management, because it's a little bit more complex to explain, but as a Drupal project, we really try to, we have to keep Drupal secure at all times, right? And so we need to pick a project that's compatible, if you will, with our release management process. Meaning, if we picked a JavaScript framework which releases a new version every year and breaks backwards compatibility, it's impossible for us, because we would need to release a new version of Drupal every year too. So we don't want that. So that means we need to pick projects that will say, we're going to release a version and we're going to be API backwards compatibility, and we're guaranteeing that we'll do that, or at least security updates for, 8 years. Right? Not every project says that. It requires a level of, sophistication or commitment or resources behind those projects that matters to us, because, we see that now, like we already do Symfony, other components, and so our release process needs to look at all these components, not just Symfony, but also jQuery, or, in the case of React, and we need to find a release model that works and that guarantees to our users a secure version of Drupal at all times, as well as the migration strategy from one version to another, right? So we could say, like for example, in the case of Symfony, I think they announced that they would, Symfony, the version that we're on right now, would be end of life, I think it was November 2021 or 22?
22, I think, and it's 3.4.
Right. And so, but that's great that we have that date. We need that date. Not every project puts the data, but then the date needs to be far enough out as well, because it means that, let's say, all Drupal page sites need to be running on Drupal 9 by that date, right? So we need to work backwards from that date, and then say we release Drupal here, then give people enough time, which could be 2 years, 3 years, whatever, to actually do their upgrade. So, anyway, I'm answering your question in a very long-winded way, but between the momentum in the market, the maturity of the technology, the richness of the ecosystem, so we like that. For example, React Native. Something that not all of the other projects have. So we looked at all of these things. And lastly, I would say we also looked at what the people that committed to do the work wanted. Like, we have a number of people that stood up and raised their hand and said, we want to help make this happen. we want to do this prototype, we want to build this UI, and and they said, and we want to do this in React, which was another data point. It was not the only data point, but that matters too. You want to do something like that, you want to use another framework, you can go build your own prototype in that framework and go look at it, right? So that's also an element. So long answer to a simple question, but hopefully it was helpful.
You found a way to improve usability by stopping spam, and you were able to do so without interference of clicking on different features to identify what's a car, what's a storefront, or input CAPTCHA. And that had been used widely through Drupal for many years, and earlier this year it was discontinued. Could you explain a little bit more about Column and the process that went through deciding to discontinue that?
Yeah, it's more of a, so Mollum, not everybody may know Mollum, I'm not sure, but it's, so it's a little startup, I guess, that I started 2008. About 10 years ago, I had a lot of spam on my website, and I finished my PhD, which was, I love my PhD work because it was very, I'd say very technical, but also involved a fair amount of sort of statistical analysis and that kind of stuff. And so I kind of miss some of that deeper, engineering work, for lack of a better word. And so I decided to write a spam filter on my site for fun. And that evolved into a little startup, and then eventually, Acquia, that's my other company, decided to buy Mollum. And that was a decision that we made in collaboration with our board of directors. They said that we really want more of your time, all of your time, instead of me splitting my time. And frankly, for me as well, that was important because I always try to keep these strictly separate, and so I would do conference calls for Mollum, like starting at 5 a.m. in the morning till 7 a.m. and then eat breakfast, help the family, and then go to work. So like, all right, I'm going to merge it with Acquia. We did, and then earlier this year we decided to stop Mollum, and the reason is twofold, because one, it never really grew to be sort of a significant line of business for us. I mean, it was good, but not great. And so we decided to focus on fewer products. And we also felt that there was good alternatives there. It could be reCAPTCHA and other solutions. So we decided to stop it. I know it's not very well liked by a lot of people, but that's what we did. So people have asked me whether I would open source it, people could run their own. It's an interesting idea, I'm happy to consider it. I just haven't really had the time to do that. But that's still on my to-do list as well. Question here.
Thank you, Luis, for a very insightful presentation. I knew, you mentioned 6 focus for now, in terms of JavaScript. I knew about half of them, but one of them really stood out to me a lot. And it was about we're now building new admin streams on React, and we want to make them, or find a way to make them notifiable by someone like a developer via a module. So the example that I think about is if you have a regular form using the form API, we were able to do a form editor to modify, add more elements or remove the presentation, change the presentations any way we want. Is the goal to be able to do the same with the React UI? We provide a default app and default presentation on React, but allow developers to modify that in the same way that we're able to modify regular forms in Drupal.
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer, to be honest. I think the question was, will we be able to do something like a forum author in React? Is that the question? No, I don't know. I mean, as I said, I'm not a React developer, so I'm afraid I can't answer your question. I can find out. I'm happy to tweet it once I find an answer, but I don't know off the top of my head. Sorry. There's also a question here.
Hi, Dries, and everyone. I'm Mickey from Garrett, and I'm not a developer, and I'm certainly not a front-end developer, but I'm kind of a detective, and I hear things and talk to people about the JavaScript thing. And apparently there are free JavaScript, free software, and there is proprietary JavaScript. And I guess JavaScript is in libraries, so it would be like a proprietary library of JavaScript. I'm wondering, are there any rules, or is there any plan of whether we use proprietary libraries or free JavaScript, as in the Libre.js project? That's something that anyone can jump in on too, to help with the free JavaScript library. But our friend Richard Stallman has an article called The JavaScript Trap. You can just do a search for it and read about it. As I said, I'm not a developer, so I'm not that knowledgeable about what the deep issues are, but I know, I'm wondering, will that be factored in as to how, if the JavaScript is in core, will we be asking our users or site visitors to be downloading non-free JavaScript in their browsers or using it in their browsers?
No, we only want to work with open. So I'm not read the article from Richard Stallman, so I can't really comment on that. I mean, dream to read it, and I will. But we actually have always, I would say, been very thoughtful about what we add to core. I mean, like, even with going back to jQuery, like, they had a license that we didn't quite like, and they had the GDL for us, right? And so jQuery decided to re-license so that Drupal would adopt it. Yeah, great. Yeah, and the same was true with React in a way. Like they had a pattern clause, and we said no, and we don't want that. And so we actually, if you read my blog posts, these blog posts that we can't use React because of the pattern clause. And then all of a sudden, I think the WordPress project, which I sent emails to the React, I don't know what they call it, leadership, I guess. And so we asked them to drop that clause, and eventually they did. And then I think all of the projects, well, not all of the projects, but many of the projects, including Drupal, felt like, all right, now it's in the spirit of free software, in the spirit of open source. So to the best of my knowledge, it's all open source. Maybe a question here. I can read the question. It's been very patient. I'll read the question.
So I've been working on a customer relations type of thing that would be decoupled, so that you would have it in Drupal 8, but it could service various mobile applications, maybe Drupal front end, maybe WordPress front end, whatever those pieces are. Something sort of like the cross between City CRM, which is really funky in its operation, that didn't move smoothly to Drupal 8, and something like Salesforce. So if you took those, and then what my question is, how does the moving to the REST API, which is sort of the future structure of this, how does that impact, or how would you say that would change the way that you would look at developing something where you have a large decoupled Drupal type of setup with a database, and you're trying to make it work with these different applications, which might not be Drupal,
Right.
that you want to have some way of making, how would you use that REST API, or not REST API, the React REST API for it?
It's a kind of complicated question, but I think the question was, if you have maybe a larger application, you use Drupal as backend, maybe a different kind of front end, maybe another application, how would you use React with that?
Yeah, in other words, if we're using Drupal 8 as the base for data-driven, uncoupled Drupal, with the changes towards the React.js, I'm trying to see, well, what advantages would that have, or what traps is that going to create as I'm trying to build this structure?
So I'm not sure if it was entirely clear, but the React piece that we're prototyping would just be the Drupal's own administration UI, right? It wouldn't dictate people to also use React to build their front ends. So you can build an Angular application on top of Drupal that serves your users, the visitors of your site, but then Drupal's own administration UI would use React. Does that make sense? Maybe I need to whiteboard it. There is a whiteboard. Or a blackboard. Let me try and answer it offline, that's okay.
Sure. I didn't realize that the React was intended only for admin UI.
Yes, sorry. Could have made that more clear, but it's only for the Drupal's own admin UI. You know, where you create maybe where you configure the permissions, where you maybe create a layout, where you do these kinds of things. But to be very clear, we want people to use whatever framework they want on the front end of Drupal. Even like if you want to build a decoupled PHP front end, you can. If you want to use Java instead of JavaScript or .NET to build a front end application with Drupal in the back end, you can. Right? So we purposely said we don't know what people want to use, and in fact, we know people want to use all sorts of different things, whatever they feel is best, or whatever they feel, they know. And we want to encourage people to use Drupal with any of these technologies on the front end. But on the back end, we need to, obviously, if you want to ship Drupal with a new backend in a JavaScript framework, you need to make a decision on which technology to use. But it doesn't impact the front end. Now, if your application exposes things that are not in Drupal's backend UI, you would have to use it for that.
So I'm pretty sure it was 10 years ago at this conference that you spent a little time sincerely apologizing for the design effort in Drupal up to that date. Do you remember?
I do.
And I think it's pretty safe to say you acknowledge that there's still kind of road to go down, but you definitely don't have that same air of embarrassment. So I think it's fair to congratulate the project and Dries' leadership to a certain extent on kind of turning that ship and giving us something that doesn't need that kind of apology. Agree? All right.
Thank you. It's the work of many people, right? I mean,
Definitely, but your vision and your leadership and your call to action,
yeah.
I think we can all acknowledge it.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually a little bit stressful at times because.
You can just leave it right there.
But I do have a question for you.
No, but I want to say something because, driving change is hard, right? And 10 years ago, 2007, we said we need to make Drupal easier to use. And it was a bit of a controversial statement at the time. And we really struggled to do so. And actually, one of the things we did is, after we decided to hire Mark Bolton, how many people noticed? And we said, all right, we got to hire external people to help us make Drupal easier to use. And that caused all sorts of fires. And it wasn't perfect, right? There was good things and bad things about it, but we did some bold things, is what I'm trying to say, to try and advance that mission. And React is not unlike that, right? I mean, it's not everybody loves it, not everybody wants it, but I really do hope it helps us move forward. And it's true that Drupal was hard to use 10 years ago, but it's still true today. I'm not satisfied with Drupal's ease of use. And the reality is that people's expectations are actually changing, and they're changing faster than they were changing 10 years ago, right? People now live in the application, and they're much more demanding than they are 10 years ago. So I think we're not done, and we need to stay focused on this because it's only going to matter more. And so I'm hopeful we all keep investing in making Drupal easier to use, because it is the number one thing in my mind that's holding Drupal back. Like the number one thing. So, but I'll take the compliment.
No, let's call that a good question too. That was perfect. Good answer.
Again, the work of many, many people.
Well, thank you, that was awesome.
All right.
Bye.